Dear all, welcome to the fall series of the Heat Roadmap Europe webinar series. In the spring, we had seven webinars, and this fall, we are going to have 8 webinars, where this is the first one. We will talk today about the result of the Heat Roadmap Europe scenarios for Europe towards 2050 and the roadmaps for decarbonising the heating and cooling sector in EU. After the webinar presentation, there'll be a chance to pose questions where I, myself, Brian Mathiesen and Rasmus Lund will be present. Europe has a huge challenge in regards to decarbonising the energy system. The heating and cooling sector has been vastly overlooked during the past decades. In Heat Roadmap Europe, we try to address the heating and cooling sector from a holistic approach. If we look at the demands for heating and cooling, overall, 40 to 50% of all countries' demands stem from heating and cooling, and the remaining is electricity, industry, and transport. So it is very important that we have a good approach to the heating and cooling sector. If we look at heating and cooling compared, it is also clear that heating is much more significant than cooling, even in those countries where you would expect cooling to be dominating. Actually, heating has a higher demand overall. The Heat Roadmap Europe project is part of a series where the first study was conducted in 2012, focusing on how a thermal system could play a role in Europe. The second study was regarding the balance between heat savings and a new heat supply for Europe. The last study before this project is the Stratego project, where low carbon heating and cooling strategies were performed for 5 member states. And in this project, we are covering 14 of the European member states, equivalent to about 90% of the heat market. The Heat Roadmap Europe project has more than 20 partners. The partners are from industry, different organizations, as well as university partners. The project covers the subjects that are crucial to understand the heating and cooling market, namely, how do we do refurbishments, do end-use energy savings in residential buildings, in services, and in industry? What is the knowledge base on the thermal grids? What is the knowledge base on the heating technologies, such as heat pumps? What is the knowledge base on cooling technologies, such as district cooling? And all of these competences are combined in the Heat Roadmap Europe methodology, and has resulted in the analysis that we are presenting here in this webinar. Europe has a long-term target of decarbonising the CO2 emissions by 80 to 95%, and actually currently the overall target is trending towards the 95% target. And we're trying to address this in the scenarios that we're presenting. In the short term, it is clear that the Energy Union is focusing on only a part of the energy system. There's no direct focus on the heating and cooling sector. And the hope is that we, with this project, can actually have a bit more focus on that. The focus right now is energy savings and energy efficiency. First principle is electricity in the energy system. It's more decentral production. It's gas in a transition. contribution from nuclear and renewable energy, as well as the geopolitical aspects of imports and prices. There are more investment needed, and it's clear that we will have less cost for fuel if we do it in a good way. And the Commission expects higher electricity prices in the future until 2030, but also acknowledges that it is possible to have much lower emissions with from a technical perspective, but also within economic range. There's also been put out a heating and cooling strategy in 2016, which is the first attempt to a holistic approach to the heating and cooling sectors. In this heating and cooling strategy, energy savings and energy efficiency is combined with the supply system of electricity and district heating. And it is also mentioned here that it's important to identify the synergies. This is really what we're aiming at in this project. It is also clear that there are more policy measures needed. The gas and electricity infrastructure is being expanded in Europe, while it seems that thermal infrastructure is still lacking a focus. If we look at Europe at the moment, we can see that some countries have been having renewable energy in the heating and cooling sector, and some have less. This map here shows the penetration of renewables in the different European countries within the heating and cooling sector. As you can see, especially Great Britain and the Netherlands have a very low amount of renewable energy, while, for example, Sweden, Finland, and Austria have a rather high penetration of renewable energy. When we try to correlate that with the amount of district heating, it is clear that those countries that have district heating also have a tendency to have more renewable energy in the energy mix, while those that have individual, typically gas solutions or electricity or oil solutions, have less of a penetration in renewable energy. And of course, there are a lot of technologies that needs to play together, namely energy savings at the building level, but also the design of the heat supply system. And there's a number of reasons why there hasn't been enough focus on this, or that these technologies are not more spread. And of course, we can say that heating is complex. Can also identify that the local situation for heating is different from one country or region to another. Heating has long-term investments. There is a lack of knowledge, and we can see that heat savings and district heating have very large investment costs, which require a targeted policy. There's a cultural element as well to heating, and there are different ownership issues and profit margins that play into the changes that are happening or the changes that are not happening in the different European member states. In Heat Roadmap Europe, our aim is to provide scientific evidence to support the long-term energy strategies, both at a local, national level, but also at the EU level. We aim to empower the transition to a low carbon energy system by quantifying the various alternatives for heating. We do that by looking at today's energy system, which is predominantly fossil fuels based, and also by looking into the future energy system, much more complex and interconnected, where we will have to use both the electricity grid, the thermal grids, and the gas grids intelligently to have storage across the different sectors, but also be able to integrate more and more renewable energy. In the fall, we will have a number of webinars, as I mentioned in the beginning. This is the first webinar where we'll present the overall results in a minute. The next webinars are focused on different technologies, such as cooling, for example, or on different regions and countries throughout Europe. And now I'll give the word to my colleague, Rasmus Lund.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for attending this webinar. The next about half an hour, 35 minutes, I will try to introduce the scenarios and the results of these. But before I start, I'll just remind you that this webinar format allows you to post some questions in the menu. So please feel free to do that. We will not read them during the presentation, but afterwards we will have read some of the questions and try to answer them here, me and Brian. First, I will start out by telling a little bit about the background of the scenarios and how we have worked with them and made them. And then the second part of the presentation is about the results of the scenarios and what we draw out of these scenarios of conclusions and so on. So, but to start with, I'll just say a little bit about the background and how we have worked out these scenarios, because it has been it's a long project and we have many partners, and we have here in this slide here 4 energy models that we have been working with, integrating in this project to provide the best possible results and to be able to, on the best possible ground, say something about what the heating and cooling sector should look like in the future, and what it should and how it should play a part in the energy system. So the first model here is the PETA tool, the Pan-European Thermal Atlas, which is a tool for mapping. Well, it's actually an online tool where you can go and have a look at the data yourself also, but the core has been mapping the heating demands and heat resources for Europe on a very high geographical resolution. The second tool we have here is forecast, and it's for profiling or analyzing the heating in a high degree of detail, which has not been done in this kind of project before. So what is the distribution between different kinds of heat demands and so on. The third tool is the times tool, the HRE EU times model, that models all the EU countries plus a few more with all the countries simultaneously operating, so to say. And this is a transition model, so it models all the energy system, including the heating and cooling sector. And then the last tool here is the energy plan model that we here at Aalborg University has been working with, but I'll say a few more words about that in a minute. But just a few more things about the model, and the idea here in this project is to first describe the heating and cooling sector and the demands and resources in a high degree of detail to have a solid foundation for that part. And then in the second phase, you can say, to put the heating and cooling sector into the bigger perspective of the whole energy system. So that is the idea with the combination of these tools, and the reason why we have all the 4 here is that, of course, the PETA is the geographical aspect, which is really important when we talk about heating and cooling. It is really a local issue, so the mapping is really important here. But what is also important is that the transition and how we can expect the different parts to evolve and change over time. And both the forecast model and the HRE EU times is modeling the transition of the systems. And then lastly, the last link in the chain here, the energy plan model, is where we go back to looking at 1 year in a high degree or high level of detail in an hourly modeling. To the next slide here. So we look at using the energy plan tool. We look at the energy systems in an hourly resolution and with the purpose of like really looking at the sector integration. So, for example, the diagram here about how the energy plan model works shows that we have many different components of the energy system. And for example, we have the black lines showing the electricity grid, and we have the red lines, which are the thermal grids, and then we have the yellow ones, which are the gas grids. So they all link up through a number of different technologies here, conversion units, storage units, and so on. And all this is modeled on an hourly basis, and it's all like working dynamically to make sure that we can really identify what is the role of the heating and cooling supply in the energy system. Yes, so that is really how we have been handling these scenarios. And to say a bit more about the data flow and where what the different parts play in the big picture. So as I said, the forecast and PETA tools, they focus on the heating and cooling sectors. As you can see here, the forecast provides data about industry and the built environment, and not only the demands, but also in terms of potentials for reducing the heat demands and cost for that. And the PETA 4 provides data on the district heating and cooling, distribution cost, but also renewable energy sources, and the geographical links is important here. So what is actually located close to what resources are located close to demands and so on, to identify in a more detailed way the potential for these structures. And then the times model has also more than the industry and the built environment, also in the electricity sector and the transport sector and the transformation sector of the energy system. So this is basically all parts of the energy system covered in the GRC times. And you can see all the arrows point into the black box with energy plan, because this is where we finally carry out the analysis and make the actual scenarios. We also have some hourly distributions in the lower right hand corner, and some costs, which has also been developed through this project, but it all it ties up in these scenarios, and they all play their role. A little bit about the scenario structure. We have a few different scenarios in the project that we have developed to be able to really analyze and say something about what we would like to say something about. So the starting point is these the baseline scenarios here, BL 2015 and 2050 baseline. That is started by the heating and cooling demands made in the forecast model, and then which feeds into the GRC times model, and then into the total energy European energy system in the modeling the transition from 2015 to 2050, and this is what we refer to as the baseline scenario. And what has kind of on this transition in the model is the current policy in the EU. So this baseline scenario, it describes like, or it's what we can expect if we, you can say, keep the current policy, very roughly speaking. So this is a starting point for scenarios. So to be able to then analyze and have something to compare with, we have two different alternative scenarios here. And the first one is the CD, it means conventional decarbonization. And the second one is HRE, the Heat Roadmap Europe scenario, and both for 2050. And the reason why we have two different scenarios here is that the baseline scenario is not a decarbonized scenario. The baseline scenario is as I mentioned, based on the current policy, and the current policy do not necessarily imply a decarbonization or decarbonization to something that's close to the EU goals. So therefore, we have made in the first place the conventional decarbonization 2050, and to do that, we have used some inputs for the sectors or the parts of the energy system that is not covered by the Heat Roadmap Europe project. So, for example, the transport sector is something we have not covered, but to be able to put the heating and cooling sector into the context of a decarbonized energy system, we have like set up this conventional decarbonization scenario to have something to compare with another decarbonized energy system where we have the whole energy system covered, and to be able to show that these recommendations and suggestions we have for the heating and cooling sector makes sense in a decarbonized energy system, because this conventional decarbonized energy system, it reaches a decarbonization level of 80% compared to 1990. That is within the long-term goals of the EU, which is 80 to 95% decarbonization. So this conventional decarbonization scenario reaches that goal, but it's not what we can call decarbonization. So the same inputs we have made in the conventional decarbonization scenario for these points listed here have also been implemented into the Heat Roadmap Europe scenario. But to distinguish the two scenarios, of course, we also have some of the important assumptions that we really have developed and are the core of the Heat Roadmap Europe project. I'll say the demand reductions and the renewable energy potential, the excess heat sources, and the potentials for district heating, and an updated thermal energy supply system. So these things, of course, come into the Heat Roadmap Europe scenario as well, and essentially makes up the difference between the conventional decarbonization scenario and the Heat Roadmap Europe scenario. But both of them being lower than, or at least 80% decarbonized. Moving a bit closer to the actual results, these scenarios that we now have developed, or that I have described, we have been using to try to identify the balance between savings in the heating sector and the supply of heating. That is interesting, and it's a discussion of how much should we invest in buildings to reduce the heating demands in the buildings, and how much should we invest in supplying the heat in new ways, for example through heat pumps, electricity, and so on. So this balance is really important, but it's quite difficult to identify the balance because there are so many. There are geographical issues, and there are many different types of savings and perspectives on that, and we have different types of supply. So this is really what we have been trying to do, and what we have a really good foundation in this project to say something about. Now you can see in this in the figure here, it really shows that the cost of savings increase somehow exponentially or similar. So the more we want to save, the higher the marginal cost for the saving gets, whereas the cost for supplying heat is more or less constant. Well, when we look at district heating, it's not exactly like that, but I will come a bit back to that. Here's an example of how we have been working with this balance and trying to identify the balance between savings and supply of heat. And this table here, it's showing on the horizontal axis. You can say it's showing savings in or reductions in the heat demand additional to the savings already applied in the baseline, because baseline scenario already have some savings included, actually quite some savings, but this is even additional to the baseline. And then on the vertical axis, we have the share of district heating out of the total heat market. So this means that 0% here on the vertical axis means that all of it is covered by heat pumps in this case. And the further we go down, the more of the heat pumps are replaced by district heating. So in the top, the cheaper district heating areas, and for example the inner cities and so on, and then the further we come down, the higher the costs. And as you can see in the figure, it's relatively high numbers, and they're not that different when looking at them just like that. But it's because it's a total energy system costs. So we have applied these colors to show where or how the trends in the numbers look. There is an area in the middle of around 10 to 15% additional savings, and then from maybe 20% district heating. This is a kind of an area where the costs are lower, total energy system costs are lower, which identifies a kind of the area of where this is the most feasible combination of savings and mix of district heating and heat pumps for the supply of heating. This is just one example out of we have done this exercise for all the countries for a number of different issues, but some just to draw some general you can say findings out of this. One of them is that when reducing the heat demands, we do not see an effect on the feasibility of district heating. So one could imagine that when saving a lot of heat, then district heating would get less feasible. But we actually do not see that trend in the results. For any, now this is an example, but we do not see that trend anywhere. And then another finding is that in the data we have, savings in industry is and service in general is very feasible. In generally in all countries there is a high feasibility of these savings, whereas the residential sector savings, in some countries it's only around 0% additional savings to the baseline, or maybe 5 around there, whereas in other countries it could be a lot more, around all the way to the 25% additional savings. And that's basically the building stock of the countries that differs a lot. When we look at the overall thermal demands, this graph here shows that the total thermal demands, they decrease from the baseline of 2015 to the baseline of 2050, and then also again to the Heat Roadmap Europe scenarios. And already in the baseline, as you can see, the red part, the space heating, is quite a lot reduced, but it even is reduced further in the Heat Roadmap Europe scenario. So we find that the current policy that is reflected in the baseline 2050 is feasible, and even more savings in general are actually feasible. So we should go further than that. The savings here, that is a combination now. This is the total thermal demands, and you can see that cooling demands actually increase the total cooling demand, but we still have implemented some Heat Roadmap Europe scenario, some efficiency measures also in the cooling, and some reductions in demand, but the total demand is expected to increase towards 2050 because of cooling and a lot of other things that is increasing in like the societal demand for that kind of processes. When we look at the supply of heat, here the balance between heat pumps and district heating, we have found that heat pumps in the building should be increased to about half of the heat market. Right now it's about 1% only, but that should be we recommend that is increased, and the same for the district heating supply, which should also increase from currently around 12% of the heat market to cover the other half around of the heat market. So fuel boilers and electric heating do not really have a feasible role to play, or there might be some niche areas where it's hard to cover the heating demands by other means, but generally fuel for heating should be avoided. Here we are of course talking about space heating and low temperature heating. When we talk about the high temperature process heat, it's a little bit harder to completely avoid fuel, but for the space heating, this applies. Following that, this graph here shows the share of the heat market covered by district heating in the baseline of 2015, the red columns, and the baseline of 2050, and the conventional decarbonized scenario, that's the same, which is the blue. And then we have the Heat Roadmap Europe scenarios, which is the gray columns with the green on top, which is an interval of a feasible share of district heating. And you can see on the right-hand side of the chart, there is the summarized version for all the 14 Heat Roadmap Europe countries. And you can say that the green part, the feasible share, goes from around 30% up to about or 35 up to around 70%. That's quite a big spread. And in what we call the heat roadmap Europe scenario, we haven't gone all the way to 70%. Actually, we are quite a bit more conservative. We are only around like 45% of the heat demand covered by district heating. But there is actually a significant potential for district heating, and even to go further than what we have in the heat roadmap Europe scenario. So and the further, generally, the more the district heating share is increased, the more fuel efficient the system gets. Yeah, there are, as you can see, now we have all the countries here. There are quite some differences between the countries. Some have already quite a lot of district heating already today, and it's not really that there is a correlation between where there is district heating today and where there is a big feasibility for having district heating. For example, Spain, Italy, and United Kingdom are examples where there is almost no district heating today, but a huge potential. So that's an interesting result. One then could ask, why is there such a big difference between the different countries here? And I can't give you all the reasons in this webinar, but in the webinar series, there are other webinars where we look into some of the details of different issues related to different groups. But I have picked 2 countries here with quite different district heating, and found one of the main reasons for the difference. And this graph here is a result out of the work with the PETA maps, and which Halmstad and Flensburg has been doing, partners in the project. And the first graph here is for Hungary, which has one of the lowest district heating potentials. And you can see that this is a cost curve for district heating, and it basically shows that the red curve is the Hungary curve, and that goes way steeper than the average of the 14 heat roadmap Europe countries. That means that it's more expensive to go further in the heat market with district heating. So that's reason here. And then if we take the other example, Italy, it looks like this, and you can see that quite a bit lower than some of the countries, the black one, and that means that the district heating can go further. But there are also other reasons. These cost curves here are not the only reason. We also have, for example, that Italy has more excess heat available per district heating demand, and also a lower grid loss because of higher heat density. There are other reasons, but these are some. So just to give you, if we look at the production mix, an important point is that we have a very diverse mix of heat sources. Of course, the CSP here, it takes up a big part, but it's not that any single part of the district heating supply mix, or that the feasibility is dependent on any single heat source. So we can remove the district heating completely, and then there is still a significant feasibility for district heating. A bit lower than if we do have district heating, but not at all. It doesn't remove the feasibility at all. And the same for any other of the heat sources. They do not remove the feasibility. It's mostly, but it can reduce feasibility a little bit. This figure here, it's showing, you can say, a general trend in in the scenarios. And the main point here, big blue circles here, illustrate the primary energy supply of the total EU 14 countries here, the baseline 2015, and then on the right-hand side, the heat roadmap Europe 2050. You can see the blue circle is the primary energy supply, which is decreased in the heat roadmap Europe scenario. And then you can see the pie chart in the middle with the blue, green, and red. That is illustrating the electricity production. And you can see that total gets bigger in the heat roadmap Europe scenario. And just to say that we actually have an increasing scenarios, and that comes both because of we have quite a large expansion in heat pumps. Also, we have electrolyzers and other new electricity demands in these scenarios because of the effort to decarbonize the energy systems. And then the last part, the yellow circle in the middle, illustrates that at the same time as the electricity production increases, we also have an increasing thermal network development, so mainly district heating. Yeah, so this is just illustrating some of the trends. Last three slides now with some of the core results about primary energy cost and CO2 emissions. This figure here shows the primary energy supply of the total of the analyzed countries for the baseline 2015-2050, and then the conventional decarbonized energy system and the heat roadmap Europe scenario. The red parts in the figure, that's the fossil fuels, and the dark blue is nuclear, and the rest is renewable energy sources. And you can see that in the baseline there's obviously a lot more fossil fuels than in the decarbonized scenario, but also the nuclear is reduced quite a bit, and then renewables is increased quite significantly. One thing that is to be noted here is the consumption of biomass, because we use quite a lot of some biomass in both the conventional decarbonization scenario and the heat roadmap scenario. However, a bit less in the heat roadmap scenarios. But the biomass consumption here is quite high, and it's maybe a bit higher than what would be recommended from a sustainability point of view. This is something that should be worked further on, and in a further effort, it would be good to look into some of the synergies that can be obtained when implementing more variable renewables and integrating the different energy sectors. And I know, for example, HRE is working here, working on that in a number of other projects, but right here, this is just the reason for that. When that is said, the total fuel consumption or combustion of fuels is decreasing from the baseline into both the conventional decarbonization and the heat roadmap. And generally, the heat roadmap Europe scenario is in the same order of magnitude in the total level of primary energy as the baseline scenarios. The total energy system cost is reduced in the heat roadmap Europe scenarios compared to the conventional decarbonization scenario. As you can see here, the annual investment costs, they increase, and at the same time the fuel costs, they decrease. And that trend is the same for all the countries, because this kind of initiatives that we have introduced into the scenarios, they have this heating, for example, includes some investments, and heat pumps include some investments, but on the other hand saves some fuel. And these investments, they create jobs, and they also have the influence that they reduce the energy price fluctuations in the countries. At the same time, the reduced fuel consumption also lead to lower dependence on import of fuel. So coming to the last slide, in the headline and in the purpose of the project, the decarbonization is one of the important terms. So this is of course also of interest here, and here you can see, all comparing to the 1990 level of emissions for these 14 countries, looking at 2015, and the baseline scenario for 2050 that is reduced somewhat in emissions, but not a whole lot. And then coming to the conventional decarbonization scenario, which is about 80% reduction, and then the heat roadmap Europe, which is approaching 90% reduction compared to 1990. So that is coming to the end of what I wanted to say. I hope it made sense to you and you have found it interesting. And I think now we will go to the question round. Here's another question. What do you see for decarbonizing hard-to-treat rural homes? Can heat pumps operate efficiently in these settings? I think there are definitely some buildings that are really difficult to implement heat pumps into directly, because they for heat pumps to be efficient, they will need very thorough renovation or something like that, which might not even be feasible. So in my opinion, there will be some buildings in the transition towards 2050, or maybe probably even further, that cannot be supplied with one of these two solutions. So maybe a biomass boiler, for example, or maybe it could be a combination of a heat pump and for some parts of the building, maybe a biomass boiler. But there are definitely buildings that are not feasible for any of these two. We are aware of that, but this is just to show the impact of these we see as the key and most preferable options in the future. And then there is a question in the second last slide. Is it annual investments until 2050 or annual investments only in 2050? And what will be the trend between now and we have put up the last slide here. These are annual costs in 2050, so not annual investments until 2050. It is the cost in 2050, so to say. And I think the trend it would be a gradual transition from the current system and towards the heat roadmap. But of course, there are a lot of political work to be done before we can start this transition. So unfortunately, I don't think it will start right away. but hopefully as soon as possible, because it is a lot of investments that will have to be implemented, and it takes a long time to make this kind of transition. The share of waste heat seems low in the EU energy mix. Are there incentives to connect district heating to waste to energy systems in the EU? Yeah, it is on the waste heat is on the conservative side in the scenarios. I think they might they could be bigger. I think if it's a big if an effort is made to make more waste incineration for heat production, I think it can be possible. But I think on the other hand that it might also be worth considering using waste for recycling or maybe producing biogas out of biodegradable waste. Because waste incineration is not super effective, and it's in an energy system like what we describe here. We have a lot of fluctuating renewables, and we need instead of a baseload heat production unit like a waste incineration plant, it's better to have like a responsive production unit to produce heat. So biogas is much more feasible in this kind of system compared to waste incineration.
We think that the waste heat used could be larger in the future than what we have in our scenarios, but we prefer to be on the conservative side in what we have actually modeled. There is a question regarding the role of solar thermal, and this is of course connected to the heat sources that we are putting in our modeling results. It is clear that the most important storage sizes and storage roles are rather short term. They will be different in smaller cities than in larger cities, but in general, over the year, we should have some thermal storages between maybe 6 hours and 48 hours that would be able to cover the very low, let's say, the variations in the heat production in the very short term, and also enable the use of combined heat and power and heat pumps to work up against the electricity sector. There's another question regarding the sizes of the system, and here, if we look at the PETA maps, it is clear that already rather small systems can be feasible. So we have a wide range, and it's really more connected to the energy density, the amount of energy savings possible, than the actual size of the city. There's another question regarding the PowerPoints, and I think the PowerPoint should be available online within 2 working days, I suspect. All right, I think we will end today's session. I hope you have enjoyed it, and you're most welcome to download our material or to post questions. I hope you will like to follow the next webinars. The first one coming up is on the 11th of October, and it is concerned with, again, the results of the heating and cooling strategies, but this time for regions with a highly developed gas sector. Thank you.